Let's talk about a government power that's both fascinating and, honestly, a little terrifying. It's called eminent domain. It's this incredible force that can shape a nation's future, but at the same time, it can uproot a person's entire life. So yeah, let's get right into it. So just imagine for a second, you get a letter in the mail. It says the government is taking your house, your land, everything, not for a new highway or a school, but to make way for a fancy hotel and a golf course. Sounds crazy, right? But it's a very real question, and it's at the absolute heart of what we're digging into today. So really, can they do that? Well, the power that makes this whole scenario possible is eminent domain. It's a fundamental power that almost every government has. Now, there are two really big conditions. First, the owner has to get paid a fair price. That's the just compensation part. And second, the government can only take the property for public use. And that little phrase right there, public use, well, that's where all the drama begins. To really get a feel for how this plays out in the real world, we're going to walk through a huge landmark legal battle from the Philippines back in 1983. It's the case of Heirs of Ardona versus Reyes. And believe me, this case really forced the courts to figure out where you draw the line between a government's grand vision and a person's simple right to their own home. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the government's massive project. Then, we're going to dissect that all-important legal term, public use. After that, we'll explore a really powerful counter-argument, see what the court ultimately decided, and then wrap up with why this one case from decades ago still matters so much today. All right, so our story kicks off in Cebu City. The Philippine Tourism Authority, let's call them the PTA, they had this grand, sweeping vision for the area. The only problem? That vision required taking over a whole lot of land that people already called home. And when I say grand, I mean the scale of this project was just staggering. The PTA wanted to take over 282 hectares of private land. To put that in perspective, that's like 527 football fields. And they weren't just planning a hotel. No, this was an entire integrated resort complex. We're talking a golf course, sports facilities, malls, coffee shops, the whole shebang. So what was the government's justification for all this? Well, it was pretty straightforward. They argued that this project was a major engine for national development. It would pull in tourists from all over the world, bring in money, create jobs, all the things that would, in theory, benefit the whole country. But of course, this wasn't just empty land waiting to be developed. It was home to hundreds of families, people represented by the heirs of Ardona. And they weren't going down without a fight. They took their case all the way to the Supreme Court, basically saying, you can't just take our homes to build a resort. And this fight brought everything down to one single, massive legal question. What in the world does the Constitution actually mean by public use? So the whole case really boiled down to these two completely different ways of looking at it. On one side, you had the landowners. They were arguing for a very strict, literal definition. To them, public use meant something the public could physically walk on and use, like a road or a public park. A private resort for tourists? That just didn't cut it. But the court was considering a much, much broader view, that public use could mean anything that creates a public benefit or serves the public's interest. And yes, that includes things like economic growth from tourism. And you can really see the court's whole philosophy summed up in this one quote from the Chief Justice at the time, Enrique Fernando. He basically said that old, restrictive view was a thing of the past. In this day and age, anything that serves the general welfare could be considered a valid public use. What the court was really saying here is that the world changes. A country's needs change. And if you freeze the definition of public use in the 19th century, you're basically tying the government's hands, preventing it from tackling modern problems. The law, they argued, has to be flexible. It has to evolve. But the families weren't done yet. They had another ace up their sleeve, a really powerful argument that pitted this whole tourism project against an even bigger national priority, land reform for farmers. So they made this compelling claim. They said their land was actually covered by the country's land reform program, which was this huge constitutional effort to give farmers ownership of the land they worked. And you can see how powerful that argument is, right? Surely social justice for farmers should come before building a fancy resort. This is where the court started digging into the facts. And, this is where the family's whole argument started to fall apart. The judges asked a really simple question. Out of this entire 282-hectare project, how much of it was actually covered by land reform? The answer was just 8,970 square meters. I mean, just look at this. The amount of land under the reform program was this tiny, almost invisible sliver of the whole thing. To put it another way, we're talking less than 1 single hectare out of 282. The court's findings were just brutal for their case. Not only was it less than a hectare, but only 2 of the 40 defendants even had the right paperwork for it. And here's the final nail in the coffin for that argument. That tiny piece of land wasn't even going to be used for the resort. It was actually part of a brand new 32-hectare site where the government was planning to resettle all the families who were displaced. Okay, so with all the arguments made and the facts laid bare, the Supreme Court was ready to make its call. And the ruling? It was decisive. The court flat out dismissed the family's case and sided with the government, upholding their right to take the land for the tourism project. So why did they rule this way? Well, it rested heavily on a really important legal idea called judicial deference. Basically, what this means is that courts try not to second-guess the policy decisions made by other branches of government, like Congress. It's not the court's job to decide if a tourism project is a good or bad idea. That's for the lawmakers to figure out. And this quote from the ruling really hits the nail on the head. It says that deciding what counts as public use is primarily Congress's job. The courts, they argued, should only step in if that decision is just completely and utterly impossible or absurd. So, okay, a case from 1983, why are we still talking about it today? Well, because its ripple effects have been absolutely huge and are still felt. This one case set 3 major precedents that are still incredibly influential. First, it officially stretched the definition of public use to include this broader idea of public welfare and economic benefit. Second, it stamped its approval on tourism as a perfectly valid reason to use eminent domain. And third, it really cemented that idea of judicial deference, making courts hesitant to interfere in big development projects. And that leaves us with this huge, lingering question that never really goes away. Having a flexible idea of public use can definitely fuel a nation's growth, but it also hands the government an immense amount of power. So, in this constant push for progress, how do we find the balance? Where exactly is the line between the good of the community and the rights of the individual? That's the debate that cases like this force us again and again to confront.